And one of the goals currently of the new NACE that we want to write into it is a new formula for the funding of secondary schools. Let's face it, there are some schools in Barbados that don't have an illustrious alumni. They don't. And there are some schools in Barbados where you have to be able to provide a lot more resources to deal with the myriad problems that they encounter than other schools. And therefore we are trying to work out a formula whereby some schools will be funded more to address some of the disciplinary challenges that they currently face. A school, for example, riddled with dyslexia, ADT, the whole range of problems, for example, will need more resources. Specialist trained teachers, micro labs, for example, more psychologists, more social workers, more guidance counselors, a whole range of psychosocial professionals that a school where students are normally considered smarter may not have. I'm qualifying. You have your problems too, the schools with the so-called bright children, but I'm sure not as many as those that will be fighting on the streets, for example, that you see some evenings, running with a hammer, etc. Now, we also outlined that at the time, to deal with the background to the disciplinary situation also must be taken into context with the governance of primary and secondary schools. One of the key recommendations that emerged from that report, from our discussions, etc., was that secondary schools should not be over 800 students. That 800 students should be the maximum. When you start going over these large numbers without the requisite staff, you will get problems. One of the other recommendations we suggested at the time was that schools should have a principal and 2 deputy principals. Well, you know, it may seem difficult to fathom. We can correct it at the level of the administration, or we can spend all our taxes funding the policemen to buy bulletproof vests and all the other equipment necessary to deal with these students. However you look at it, however you twist it or turn it, you have to spend money in education. That's the bottom line. We said the governance of the primary and the secondary schools must change. 800 students for the secondary schools, and for the large primary school, 500 principal and at least 2 senior teachers. We didn't say deputy principals as part of the governance structure. But we also recognized at the time that discipline is brought, well, everyone was passing the buck on. The university, I can tell you, we always complain that this is what we get from secondary schools. The secondary schools in turn will take it like a baton and say they got this from primary schools. The primary schools to the nursery is right into the home. And just like cock robbing, no one will take the blame. One of the recommendations, therefore, was that all students entering secondary schools should come with a developmental report to secondary schools. We wanted to remove it where if we recognize that education is developmental, then when you have difficult children at a primary school, the principals at secondary schools should be made aware of what are some of the challenges that they face. If the child, for example, is dyslexic or has a behavioral problem, I think it is fair. We felt it was fair that principals at secondary schools be made aware. It was not to victimize. It was not to pinpoint, for example, this one is from the Addams family. If you don't know who they are, for example, let me give you the history of the family tree. The father was a jailbird. The mother wasn't far removed. This one is part of the seed, therefore. It wasn't to be done in that malicious way, but in an incremental development stage for educational purposes. And we still firmly believe this, so that secondary schools can have programs in place from first form to tackle some of the challenges that they face that may appear, for example, at the end of the first term. We felt this was an idea, but the Education Act has not addressed it, and it's something that we want to look at this time around. And after we looked at the governance in the primary schools, then we came to the discipline and what are the support systems. So it is not a case about corporal punishment. We didn't go out there to write a report to deal with, we said it should be retained, but only after all of the supporting mechanisms are put in place at schools. Funding, proper allocation, development of community schools, psychosocial personnel. And the last two here, the role of the media as a stakeholder. Let us be realistic here. When you look at the socialization of the individual, the media must play a key role. This is not new. If the principle of Matthew Farley, if I take my gospel from him in his Sunday newspaper, he outlined some of the several challenges that the school faces, you're beleaguered with each day. So I'll give you an example. You have in the morning Carol Robertson crew giving you these positive messages, these values, for example, that you should learn to live by. Most of our children don't listen to 92.9. They're listening to 95.3 and 98.1. And if some of you tune into your radio when some of the so-called DJs are on, and to hear the crass behavior that emerges. For example, one evening when I was coming home, I tuned out and tuned in. Two of them were asking callers to call in regarding the blackest taxi driver that they've seen. No, and I want some of you know that Crop Over is on to listen to what they emit from the airwaves. You list, for example, and some of us must not be hypocritical about it. You have Carol Roberts in the morning, for example, trying to emit positive values, and then there's Cupid on evenings. With all the women calling in, outlining all the things that should be part of the lifestyle. And it's in prime time, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock some evenings, for example. So you have a socialization process devoid of values. If it's not devoid of values, the values are inchoate, confused, for example. And as a result, I'm not trying to be difficult here by calling a few names, but if I have to convey the example, you know what I have to say. You have the media, which should be also helping to shape the value system of children more or less displaced and misplaced. So part of the supporting system that we have to be able to think about as we look at this code of conduct for secondary schools would be, what role do we play? In addition, ethics and citizenship. There's a libertarian view emerging in our society in its truest form, not liberal. There's a very big difference between liberal and libertarian. A lot of our announcers, or those who think that they know, you have a classical liberal and a libertarian is the extreme form. Everything goes for the libertarian. And this value system is now being seen as what is to be for the status quo. Do as you please. The role of the individual is as circumspect as far as you can see your nose. Emergent, and we've had the indirect or discrete suppression of institutions such as the church. And therefore emerging, we have a society that is very difficult to manage regarding what is the ethical code of conduct, since most students or let's say the church is not playing a central role, the Judeo-Christian ethical perspective is not holding the sway it once held. Therefore, it is being replaced by other ethical schools of thought, be it an egoist, hedonistic, utilitarian, Kantian perspective. A range of them are emerging. Individualistic, if you want to add that on. And it is becoming difficult for young people to have a sense of self, what is right, what is wrong, if such value systems of relativism is allowed to take root in our society. So a number of our young people, therefore, would see in discipline not as a challenge, not as a problem. What is good for you is not the same for me, and this inconsistency with reference to what are the value systems of our wider society, they've shifted, they've changed, and they're all in a confluence, therefore, undermining the social fabric of the larger society. Therefore, when we start to look at discipline, the corporal punishment that we spoke to in the report, we are saying that corporal punishment is only one method in an arsenal of disciplinary measures that schools must have at their disposal. Yes, you can cane, or in some societies you call it paddling. The detention must come back into focus. I'm told that at some schools it has all been outlawed. Yes. Sorry? The detention. Some schools, I'm getting the impression it has all been outlawed, or it is ineffective. Yes. Well, Mr. Farley, dear God, what you have to understand is that you may not be aware, but if I may ask cheekily, do you speak for all 22 secondary schools?
Dr. Bruce? Dr. Bruce, good morning. I will have to speak for my colleagues because they're here. But we have to talk as if we understand the system that we are working in. That's how we have to speak. And detention at most schools probably don't happen at 3 o'clock, but they do happen at lunchtime because of certain challenges that are faced by those schools that have to bus students in and out. But detentions have, I've been in the system for 40 years, and we've always done detentions that way.
All right, Mr. Farley, that is your view. And we allow all views to be heard. Any other questions? Right. So, as I said, at some secondary schools, the detention process has all been but ineffective. The prefect system has pretty much broken down in a number of instances because of this new approach. Some students don't want to squeal on their colleagues or friends, and therefore they're reluctant to give detentions. Now, that has wider implications for the judicial system and for the legal system as you go into the court cases and you don't want to give evidence because you're afraid. Jamaica is a perfect example only recently of a society pretty much captivated in fear for wanting to cooperate with the law because of the deleterious consequences that could emerge from that. I don't think we have to wait for the manifestation of what is happening or has happened in some of our Caribbean neighbors before we take action as to some of the things we ought to do and should do. So if I return to Mr. Farley's point, he wants to argue the case, well, not argue, but state the case emphatically, that the detention system is working in the schools that he's aware of, then perhaps one of the things that may be up for consideration is how best can it be effective within the construct of all schools, and as well that it should be a systematic approach to discipline across the schools. One of the things that we had discussed at the NACE meeting back then, and we're looking at it again now, is that the conflict in discipline is also the result of inconsistent punishment methods across all secondary schools. So at one secondary school, a child will be punished for this thing, and at another secondary school, they go unpunished. So again, you have different conflicting approaches to punishment. And if we are going to move towards the development of a disciplinary code of conduct, then that disciplinary code of conduct, I hope, must be as uniform as possible to ensure that everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet. And we saw examples of that recently, Mr. Farley, you can correct me if I'm wrong, where you dealt with punishment with how girls should wear their uniforms. And in other schools, some students are allowed to go on punishment with the same uniform situation. So you, in your best interest, have looked to see how you ought to govern according with the rules, the protocols governing society, and other principals don't share your view. Yet you speak for your colleagues. So there's a level of inconsistency, therefore, across the system that must be addressed if we have to be able to write that disciplinary code of conduct, that everyone can have a similar approach to how matters are handled in school. If a child has marijuana in one school and they're sent home, they're suspended or expelled, the same must be done in all schools. But you can't have it in one and ignore it in the other. When we looked at some of the issues, we also spoke then about having an alternative residential school. Well, the ministry has gone full steam ahead in developing this school. However, one of the concerns that we looked at then, and this is something that I had observed when I was in the UK, an alternative school is not a catch-all for bad behaved students. Normally schools like these are very small and very, very well resourced. Those that I observed in the UK were in places like Kent, in the countryside. If they get away, it's quite far away to a town. Keep them far removed to help with the rehabilitation process. As I said, they're very well resourced, curriculum provided. Generally, those schools had about 150 students. So, although we had recommended an alternative residential school, our view of such a school was not an overcrowding where you sent your 50, you know, look, the 600 of these are behaving bad for the entire term, look, take them all and leave us with the 200 or 300. That school must be properly managed or else it will be unsustainable. And it will degenerate pretty much back into another hub of miscreants. The other area that we dealt with, the guidance counselors, we felt should be more extensively supported. And that to a large extent, the staff must be constantly trained and retrained to be able to deal with some of the challenges. One topic that we didn't quite address in the disciplinary code of conduct at the time, because it was not as ubiquitous then as it is now, is the role of information and communication technologies. And this is what we're looking at addressing in the new Education Act. We will not legislate on ICTs, but we want to draft a protocol governing the use of technologies in schools. What are some of the ethical and legal concerns of using your telephone or your smartphone? And if I can take it up to the university where we do courses like e-governance, a number of our younger students have no problems in forwarding malicious emails. A number of other challenges that we face with the technologies that a number of them are engaging in, copying and pasting pornographic material, taking the logo off of a corporate website, pasting it onto that email and then sending it off. These are the boys and girls from X Bank. These are the boys and girls from this particular institution. And it is very easy to do now with the use of various forms of technologies. You can't legislate against it because it is always changing. For some of you who can remember High Five has metamorphosed into Facebook, and what you can do on Facebook has changed drastically. The idea of anonymity, for example, some students really don't care about it. You can create a false profile and do untold damage via Facebook. So there's going to be a separate protocol governing the use of technologies for the education system, which we hope to update whichever NACE committee or commission is instituted. I'll also say at the time that this is not the finite body of ideas that we had. This is also open up to suggestions. And it is within this context, therefore, that I ask you here to see where are some of the possible areas that can be strengthened and looked at as we attempt to rewrite the education, rewrite and revise sections of the Education Act. Now, Mr. Boyce referred to something, a point earlier about children in uniforms, etc. And he premised his statement with a technical matter. One of the things that we would like to achieve with the Education Act is that we are trying to remove the rational legal approach from it. It will be strictly legal. We recognize that some people aren't rational. And therefore, as much as we can possibly codify all aspects of the education system, we will attempt to do so. Because we found, and from the situation that emerged in Barbados over the past year or so, leaving ambiguity within the Education Act can create several problems. So as much as we can tighten up the Education Act by codifying everything, as much as we can, we are attempting to do so and take away interpretation, etc. So I think that is my my presentation for discipline and support systems. Yes.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
In terms of the discipline, is there an outline for pupils as well as deputy principal or senior teacher? To what extent do they carry out this discipline? I know Matthew Farley mentioned detention.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there are different forms of disciplinary.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an outline for them to follow?
In this report, we had said, well, even now, one of the ideas is that it's going to be corporal punishment, for example, would be a last resort. You have to go through all the appropriate channels of, I guess, your senior teacher, form teacher, etc., before you administer corporal punishment. And we've also written into the report here that any abuse of corporal punishment or any disciplinary abuse would be reported to the Ministry of Education, which is responsible for monitoring all cases of it in the secondary schools and primary schools as well, because we had written this for both secondary and primary schools. So there's a systematic approach to how the discipline will be dealt with in the schools.
So the principal can determine to a certain extent what the punishment for a particular action would be?
Well, remember, this is at best a policy document. When the act is finished, developed and written, that is something now that we would have to look at. What are the steps that must be taken? Maybe they'll have to be outlined carefully with reference to the types of punishment and the discipline, who would mete out the discipline, etc. So these are areas that will be hopefully outlined in the process. But I take your point regarding that.
I'll tell you why I asked that question. I am also a parent.
Yes.
And it's not only my child's school where he goes to, but there's had also other instances of other schools. My child is 7 years old, and I know that teachers try to instill in children, let me use bathroom breaks for instance. You're trying to control it by not saying every time the child comes to you and say, okay, I want to go to the bathroom. You have to know your child, or children for that matter. And my situation, for instance, my son wanted to go use the bathroom, right? They were saying they were allowed 4 breaks. Before school, break time, lunchtime, and after school. Now I understand where the teacher is coming from in terms of trying to control the children from getting up each time to disrupt the class. But here again, you have to know the child. My son went to school in the morning time, and then could be on later than about 9:30, 10, and I got this phone call telling me to come from my son. I said, come from my son, I just dropped him off at school. He told me he had met himself. I was like, oh, he knows when to go to, when it's time to go to the bathroom. So then after I investigated, I spoke to him. I said, why didn't you go and ask the teacher to go to use the bathroom? And he said to me he didn't go because he knew that the teacher's answer would have automatically been no, because of the 4 bathroom breaks. So that's why I asked, to what extent? Because here it is now that I have to break away from my work to go and collect this child. Had he been allowed to use the bathroom, situation would not have occurred. So that's why I want to know, to what extent? When you said outline the disciplinary action, to what extent?
Well, I can't answer the extent. As we said here, the discipline would be prudently used and applied when necessary. But that is something that we would have, well, this is just, as I said, a policy document, a working document. It is not cast in stone as yet. But listening to what you're saying, that's a pretty micro, I know it's important to you because he's your son, but it's a micro situation that might have been mishandled, but yes. Might have been mishandled, but I'm sure it is not the norm. I made a counteract it when I was going to school. You were told, you go to the bathroom before you leave home, and when you come back home. No running and out, etc. It was an element of discipline that you learn to master, but as I said, different parents, different behavioral patterns, etc.
Good morning again. Good afternoon. Yes, thank you. My question is, you had mentioned that abuses of discipline will be reported to the administrator.
Yes.
My question is, one, who initiates that report? And what evidence does this person need to provide to say that there was actually abuse of the discipline? Because one person's perception of abuse may be different to another person. So who initiates the report, and what evidence do you need to give to show, well, yes, this is clear evidence that there was abuse where this particular discipline was?
Well, that would be a qualifier that would now have to be written in to any prospective act. How do you qualify abuse? Because one of the features we looked at, as I said, was that the Ministry of Education must monitor the regulations for the misuse of corporal punishment in schools and respond to complaints with appropriate sanctions against teachers and school managers who violate the regulations. So it's a general statement, and if we're going to draft it into law now, the qualifiers must be inserted. Because there's a big difference between having the authority to do something and having the power to do something. Authority is legitimacy, power is coerced. So as we write the Education Act, we are going to be hopefully very careful with the use of language in determining, for example, when we say the principal has the power, it may not be the power, he has the authority, which is very different. He must be supported by the legislative approaches. And these are some of the issues that we want to deal with. Yes, Mr. Adams.
In relation to the question that was just asked, it's possible that if you get all those questions, you have to read along the laws, implications. I think the areas that govern the school would be maybe three things. One would be the duty of care and in loco parentis. And in the other case, natural justice, where the teacher acts in a manner of a reasonable period would be the testing ground as to whether it is within the bounds of the law. And the duty of care means that the teacher has a kind of a right to act, and to act in a way that a reasonable parent would act. Not just a parent, but a reasonable parent. And the common law would really come down on the side of teacher, which is what basically happens if and when cases do go to find that the judge applied those criteria. So I think that you don't have to always amend the law. You have to look to see how you act and administer.
Yes, I quite agree with you, but if I may reflect on what I said earlier.
No, I was not going to.
Oh, right, yes, right. Because it's becoming really difficult now, right? That whole idea of duty to care has changed as well with teachers. If the law is there, the law can be very deterministic with what ought to happen. And the law can be surreptitious in some degree. And therefore, we have to be very careful in how it is applied. And increasingly, because we have a very litigious society, it seems as if you have to outline everything by the letter, or else there will always be a lawyer there in first, second, or third slips waiting to catch a teacher or principal. And therefore, we hope that the law, if it's properly codified, can protect parents, teachers, and all the major stakeholders within the system. So that's what we're trying to aim for in this new revision. We don't want to be right in every minute detail, but broad areas as well where it can come in. Yes.
Vincent Ferguson.
Yes, Mr. Ferguson, you need no introduction.
Yeah, we are seeing a new kind of indiscipline. Vincent Ferguson.
Well, I know Mr. Ferguson, he's my chairman.
Vincent Ferguson, principal, course price school. Chair,
Yes.
there's a new kind of discipline in schools. Parents coming onto the compound and behaving badly in the office or in the outer office. Instances where parents actually go to children and use threatening language, in some instances physical assaults. Have you looked at that in any way in your NACE?
Let me get that again, sorry.
Parents of students
Right.
are so grieved. They come onto the compound, come into the office, they've made demands on the principal, as a matter of fact, in the case of court. They make demands on the principal. I must see the principal this morning. I don't care what he's doing. In the case of that last 2 weeks, I must see him this morning. In some instances, they've left and gone into school and threatened students, make comments to the students. Some are physically assaulted.
Right.
Physically assaulted.
Right.
Have you looked at that
Well, that,
as a great...
right, the last Education Act did not address these matters in the same way. It's quite old. And therefore now as we rewrite it, we revise it, this is probably one of the areas that we have to concentrate on as well, to think about as we go through the revision of it. Remember some of the issues and why we ask for your feedback is that this is an indirect focus group of what are some of the challenges that could emerge or that are emerging in your schools that you want dealt with. And therefore, by voicing them now, we are able to say, well, look, principals feel aggrieved when you have delinquent parents who march into their offices demanding that they be seen or heard by the principal, and what steps now an Education Act must take in order to deal with this type of parent. Do you legislate, for example, to stop them at the gate and be checked by the watchman or the security guard, for example? Should the principal drop what he or she is doing and see this student, for example? Should the police be called in at some point to address the situation at hand? How are these parents going to be dealt with? And I've been reading in the media some of these reports with parents marching into secondary schools and manhandling principals, etc. And I think it is a distasteful approach and practice, but it is part of the larger unruly society that has crept in and has taken root in our society that we must now deal with. So how principals address this type of parents will be something that we definitely have to look at in the new Education Act, because it's not dealt with in the old one.
Dr. Brown,
Sorry?
we have one more
Yes.
question,
okay.
because we need to wrap up for
Okay,
lunch.
fine.
And there are aspects of the Education Act which deal with parents assaulting members of
but-
staff coming onto the premises.
Yeah, but most,
Is there?
well, sort of vague and
Good afternoon. My
Yes.
name is Sean Gibson, the National Council of Parent Student Association.
Yes.
And following on from the comment made by the principal of Corrigan Parish School, just let me say, the NCPD have been looking at the issue of parents being nuisances within the educational system. And I can safely say to you, after distilling this with a lot of parents, they feel alienated in the system. They don't know how to interact with the system. Hence the frustration. I believe the time is right for us to have a clear protocol on how parents engage the school system from class up. And don't assume that they know. A lot of them are not aware. And all the policies, all the procedures, all the recommendations, at the end of the day, we need to ensure that parents as a key stakeholder are aware of their roles, their rights, and their responsibilities. They feel very alienated in the system, hence the frustration and the wrong approach on numerous occasions. We do apologize to you.
all right, thank you. Just before Mr. Farley, I'm somewhat concerned as well with, and I mentioned this elsewhere, with the use of rights and privileges. Suddenly in Barbados, everyone has a right. And I get the distinct impression that they're confused with what is a right and what is a privilege. In a number of instances, people are granted privileges. A privilege can be given or taken away. A right is enshrined. And we have to be very wary as stakeholders involved in the education system of assigning rights which are enshrined and codified and privileges. And you're seeing it emerge all the time with, when principals want to take action. A child has a right to a telephone, or to bring school a telephone. A child doesn't have a right to a telephone. It's a privilege accorded by the principal, I feel. A right is a legal enactment. And when we use the language, therefore, in the new act, I hope we are very clear in our outlining of what the rights that are given to children and what are the privileges that they are given. Because you have parents bursting on the scene, my child has a right. I have a right to do this, for example. Is it truly a right you have? Or is it that you've been granted a privilege to do some of the things that you're allowed to do? And this is the sort of context that we want to recraft the Education Act, so that there is no confusion between the two. Yes, Mr. Farley.
Yes, Dr. Rose, I want to start by saying that I'm happy that after 16 years of dormancy, NACE has been able to come closer to something productive that will cause us to at least have a discussion in public domain that could lead us to a point where we could agree on some things. I think some of the suggestions that have been taken out are useful, and I'm hoping that we will just not talk about them, but we actually see some action. The alternative residential institution, I think, is a good one. I'm not sure that what is happening at Erskine Hill, Plain Hill, is exactly what we are thinking about there, though. We will need to say whether what the ministry is doing at the old Erskine site is the same thing as what is perceived by many of us in the school system as an alternative residential institution. My understanding is that the one at Erskine Hill is not residential. But my main point, Dr. Broom, is that we have to be careful that we don't behave as though we start from scratch. Because we're not. And there are a lot of good things in the system that I think we can retain. And we got to be careful about throwing the baby with the bathwater. Our system does not have a history of the abuse of corporal punishment that I've seen people being drawn before the law courts. Of course, the ministry will say they say a lot of things in the court. But I think, generally speaking, you have a responsible education administrator who punish with a human heart. My main concern is that while I support reform, and I've gone public on this, I believe that corporal punishment, we should not be too fast to kick it out as the only bugbear in the system, because it's not. But I believe that it should be retained, not with any view to ultimately abolishing it, but it should be retained as one of a range of strategies that will be available to principals and other designated persons. I don't believe that it should be given again to all teachers. I don't believe that I support that, but I believe that there are, I remember when there was some confusion in the minds of parents about who should punish. There were children who came into school and said to us, "They can't beat me now, though." And that had an impact on the tone and the level of discipline in our school. Now, I'm not saying that the only panacea for solving all the ills in education is to flog. I'm not saying that. But I just want us to be cautious about allowing ourselves to be led down that path by other outside interests and abolish it. I think it should be left as one of a range of strategies. I agree with you, Dr. Bruns. I agree with you that other support systems, psychologists, psychiatrists, all the other things, I don't know if we get money from them, but we're going to wait 20, 30 years before we get all those things that you want to happen before you abolish. I believe that we should retain it as one of a range of strategies available to principals, deputy principals, and senior teachers to be administered in a prescribed environment under certain conditions, not be free for all. That has always been my position, and you have not yet convinced me, nor NACE, that we should change.
I thought that was our position, that we are not ridding ourselves of corporal punishment. We've outlined that we will keep corporal punishment on the books. Now, this is the NACE report that was done, and in the new incarnation, we've also outlined in hopefully a proposal is that we will keep corporal punishment, but that it be used judiciously. So the new configuration of NACE, we've not gotten rid of corporal punishment. We said it must be retained. And I'll say this to you, Mr. Farley. At the end of the day, although we recommend it, the Ministry of Education will have the sole authority to remove it, because the Ministry of Education is under tremendous pressure from funding agencies such as UNESCO and a range of other international organizations from which they gain valuable resources from, financial, to conform to their behavioral patterns. Now, we have discussed this matter already within the NACE committee, and we have said, in spite of what the external institutions are recommending that we rid ourselves of it, we will keep it, but it will be conducted within a structured framework. So we have not reneged on our position from the old one to now. We've also said, because there's also a view that perhaps a study be conducted to see what the temperament of the society is regarding corporal punishment. And again, in that discussion, we were very circumspect with reference to the study that should be conducted and by whom. Because when you look at a number of studies, the methodology can lead to pre-constructed responses. You can have a close-ended questionnaire where it does not give room for elaboration or qualifiers. And therefore, it's quick to tabulate. 53% of the parents said they're for corporal punishment, 40% said no. So we are saying also that within, if any study will be conducted, the methodology to be able to determine what will be the views of the society must be clear, consistent, and allow for ideas to emerge, rather than for a quick and dirty approach to yes, no, I don't know, SPSS, 53%, 40%, these are your results. So as much as possible, we are trying to be careful in our approach to how we are going to look at corporal punishment, but we've pretty much taken the decision that it will stand on our books and it will not be gotten rid of. So it is up to the ministry now to reject the report, to when the Education Act is finally written, so we'll expunge this from it, and we're going with this. So we've tried to address that, Mr. Farley.
Thank you, Dr. Broom. Thank you for engaging us this afternoon. And I hope that from his presentation, you would have been stimulated in your thoughts about how we need to really look at discipline and how we need to approach what is happening in the schools, and that you can share that with me in our last session.